It began on a gray Wednesday in downtown Austin, the kind of day where the sky seemed permanently undecided. Elon Musk had walked the last 2 blocks alone, without security, without anyone even noticing. He liked it that way more than people thought. When things got loud, he craved stillness. And lately, things had been very loud. The restaurant wasn't extravagant. That was the point. Elon had read about it in a late-night blog post from a quiet food writer who described it as a place where no one talked above a whisper and the owner didn't care who you were. Elon had bookmarked the article without thinking. Now, 3 weeks later, he stood quietly outside the small wooden door beneath an unlit sign. It was just past lunch hour. The place looked half full through the window. Elon pushed open the door and stepped inside. The woman behind the counter didn't look up. She was older, maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and the kind of calm stillness that made other people feel rushed just by comparison. She was arranging a tray of fresh bread slices, as if each one deserved respect. Elon waited. After a full minute, the woman finally raised her eyes. Her face didn't change when she saw him. He nodded politely and said his name, not for effect, just out of habit. "I don't seat people who name-drop themselves," the woman said. Her voice was firm, not cruel, especially not billionaires. For a moment, Elon thought she was joking. Then he realized she wasn't. "I'm happy to wait," he said. "It's not about who I am. I just heard this place was good." The woman looked him over slowly, not as if she were impressed or judging, but as if she were checking for something more important than a name or reputation. Then she shook her head. "I don't serve people who come in looking for something they think money can't buy," she said. "It always ends the same." Elon blinked. "I don't want anything special." "Exactly," she said. "But you want to be seen not wanting anything special. That's still wanting something." She turned away and picked up a pot of coffee, refilling a table behind her without another word. Elon stood there for another moment, unsure whether he was supposed to leave or argue. He did neither. Instead, he walked quietly back outside and stood in front of the restaurant for a full 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He wasn't offended. He wasn't even angry. But something had shifted in him, something he couldn't name yet. Across the street, 2 construction workers were eating takeout from plastic containers, laughing about something one of them had said. Elon watched them for a moment. Then he turned left, walked to the end of the block, and vanished into the Austin afternoon without saying a word to anyone. That night, Elon didn't tweet. He sat alone in a hotel suite with the lights off and no sound but the soft hum of the minibar fridge. His phone was full of alerts, messages, invitations, decisions that couldn't wait. But none of it felt real. All he could hear was the woman's voice saying it always ends the same. For the first time in months, Elon didn't open his laptop. Instead, he closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time someone had looked him in the face and said no without fear or flattery. He couldn't think of one. He didn't feel humiliated. He felt something far stranger. He felt curious. The next morning, he returned. The door was locked. A small handwritten sign was taped to the glass. It read, "Closed until further notice. Thank you for your silence." Elon stood there a long time, reading the words again and again, as if they contained a code he had missed. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change the course of the next 5 years of his life. Not because of what had happened, but because of what hadn't. Elon Musk returned to the hotel, checked out without calling his assistant, and walked 3 blocks before summoning a rideshare. The driver didn't recognize him. Elon barely spoke. The ride ended at a small co-working space on the east side of the city, a place he had visited once years ago while meeting a friend's startup team. It was quiet and anonymous. That was what he wanted now. He didn't check into a private office. Instead, he rented a common desk under a different name and spent the day watching people come and go. Designers, writers, developers, students. Most of them looked tired in the way only people with purpose look tired. Elon didn't touch his laptop for hours. He just listened. That night, he stayed in a modest Airbnb, the kind with slightly mismatched furniture and a handwritten welcome note that ended with a smiley face. He found himself reading it twice. He spent the evening on foot, walking through unfamiliar neighborhoods. Somewhere between a laundromat and a tiny used bookstore, He passed a corner where 3 kids were selling homemade cookies. No one noticed him, not even when he bought one and overpaid. The girl running the table handed him the change and said thank you like she meant it. Elon stood there a few extra seconds, unsure whether it was the cookie or the moment that tasted better. By the end of the week, he had stopped checking the news. His phone was filled with messages from board members, engineers, friends, and strangers. He responded to none of them. The headlines speculated about his absence. Some claimed he was spiraling. Others suggested it was a PR stunt. But no one really knew. Elon had disappeared without explanation, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel pressure to reappear. 2 weeks later, he was still in Austin. Every morning, he walked past the closed restaurant. The sign hadn't changed. No one had gone in or out. Elon wondered if it had ever been opened to begin with. Maybe the whole thing had been a test. Or a message. Or maybe it was just a place that said no and meant it. He started keeping a notebook. Not for ideas or inventions, but for questions. Every page held a single sentence. Things like, what would I do if no one listened? Or, when was the last time I felt small and grateful at the same time? By the 3rd week, something in him had shifted. He no longer wanted to be heard. He wanted to understand why he had ever needed to be. He went back to the co-working space and started writing again. Not code, not company strategies. He wrote about the restaurant, about the woman who looked at him without blinking, about the silence that followed, about the way being denied something he hadn't yet asked for felt more honest than being given anything he had ever bought. One evening, long after sunset, he saw movement behind the restaurant's window. The lights were off, but a soft glow flickered once, then disappeared. Elon crossed the street and stood by the door. There was no sign of anyone inside, just a faint scent of fresh rosemary and warm bread in the air. He didn't knock. He just waited. After 10 minutes, the door opened slowly. It was the same woman. She didn't look surprised to see him. She didn't look pleased either. She looked the same way she had looked the first day, like a mirror that didn't distort anything. You're still here, she said. I didn't come back to be served, Elon said. I just wanted to understand why it mattered. The woman studied him for a long time, her face unreadable. Elon, she said, not as a greeting, but as a fact. You still think this is about you. He didn't speak. She stepped aside and let the door fall half shut between them. Then she said, it's not. And she closed the door without sound. This time, Elon didn't wait outside. He walked home slowly, turning her words over in his mind. It's not about you. He had been at the center of every conversation for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to listen without speaking, to observe without recording, to be present without being important. That night, he crossed out every sentence in his notebook and replaced them all with one question. What happens when the story is not mine? What happens when the story is not mine? Elon stared at the sentence for almost an hour. He had filled 1,000 notebooks in his life with solutions, projections, models, and ideas. But this was the first time he had written something that felt like it required no answer. The next morning, he walked past the restaurant again, but he didn't stop. He didn't look for signs of life behind the windows. He walked past it the same way everyone else did, like it was just a place with a locked door and a quiet history. He turned right at the corner and headed toward a neighborhood cafe he had found 2 blocks over. The coffee there was nothing special. The chairs were uncomfortable, but no one ever looked twice at him. That made it perfect. There was a man who sat near the window every morning, writing in a small spiral notebook and drinking tea that he never seemed to finish. Elon had seen him enough times to recognize the rhythm of his scribbling. On that particular morning, the man looked up, met Elon's eyes, and smiled. Do you write? The man asked. Elon nodded. Sometimes. Lately. The man gestured to the empty chair. Sit. There was no introduction, no exchange of names. They spoke like 2 people who had been quiet long enough to lose interest in small talk. They talked about sentences and questions and how some ideas lose their meaning when you explain them too fast. Elon mentioned the restaurant once. The man didn't ask which one. He just said, some places aren't meant to be entered. They're meant to be noticed. Elon went back the next day, and the day after that. They never spoke about companies or space or power. They talked about silence and bread and how people who have never worked in a kitchen don't understand the difference between cooking and feeding someone. By the second week, Elon started to see familiar faces. A woman who painted postcards on the sidewalk. A teenager who played cello outside the library for tips he never counted. A retired teacher who taught ESL out of her garage. These weren't people who followed headlines. These were people who built their days out of attention and small acts of presence. Elon began helping without announcement. He fixed a broken light outside the cafe. He restocked shelves at the community pantry 2 blocks away. He used cash when he could, and when someone tried to thank him, he said nothing. It wasn't humility. It was something quieter than that. It was listening. 3 months passed. The news had stopped guessing. Public statements had been issued from his companies, all composed without him. Stock fluctuations leveled. People stopped asking when he would return. The silence had settled like dust in a room that no one entered anymore. One afternoon, the man at the cafe finally asked his name. Elon, he said. The man smiled. I thought so. You knew? I wondered, the man said. But I figured if you weren't saying it, maybe that name wasn't the important one. Elon didn't respond. The man closed his notebook gently. Names are useful until they aren't. Then they become noise. That night, Elon sat by the window of his apartment and listened to the sound of the city breathing. He watched people below walk home with groceries, talk into phones, unlock bikes, laugh with tired shoulders. No one looked up, and he didn't want them to. He wasn't sure what he was becoming, but he knew what he was letting go of. The need to be heard. The need to be right. The need to be exceptional in ways that made other people small. He thought again of the woman behind the restaurant counter. The way she had said, "It's not about you." At the time, it had felt like a dismissal. But now, it felt like the beginning of something. The world would always be loud. People would always look for volume and spectacle and control. But Elon had begun to see the difference between making something important and becoming someone who didn't need to. By the 4th month, Elon had stopped measuring his days and outcomes. He no longer tracked his steps or productivity or screen time. He moved according to something smaller and more human. Conversations with strangers. Reading a book without finishing it. Making repairs no one had asked for. He learned to notice things he used to ignore. There was a bus driver who always waited 5 extra seconds for late runners. There was a man who left out a bowl of water for passing dogs, and another who carved tiny wooden birds and left them on benches for children to find. These weren't stories meant for headlines. These were lives that moved without audience, without applause. Elon began to understand something that had always eluded him. Influence was not the same as connection. People had followed him for years, but they had rarely met him. Now, for the first time in his adult life, Elon was being met. Not as a symbol, but as a person who showed up, who listened, who stayed. He still passed the restaurant sometimes. The sign never changed. The windows remained dark. But something in him had shifted so completely that he no longer felt excluded. The closed door no longer felt personal. It felt like a boundary, and boundaries, he had learned, were not rejection. They were protection. For her. For him. For whatever it was she was trying to preserve inside those walls. One morning, as he sat on a bench beside the bakery near the co-working space, a boy approached him holding a toy car with a missing wheel. The boy didn't speak. He simply held it out with open hands. Elon smiled and took the car. He spent the next 10 minutes fixing it with a tiny screwdriver he had begun to carry in his jacket pocket, a habit he couldn't explain. The boy watched in silence. When it was finished, Elon handed it back. The boy didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. The way he held the car told the whole story. Moments like that began happening more often. People came to him not because of who he was, but because of how he was. Steady, unhurried, present. Word spread slowly through the neighborhood that there was a man who helped fix things. A toaster, a leaky faucet, a jammed stroller wheel. He never took money. He never asked questions. He just showed up and stayed until it was done. By the time spring came, Elon had built a routine so ordinary it would have seemed impossible a year earlier. He woke before sunrise. He walked to the corner store and helped the owner set up crates. He brewed coffee at the cafe and wiped down tables even though no one asked him to. He spent afternoons on porches, in workshops, on sidewalks, doing whatever needed doing. He ate dinner alone and went to sleep before the world remembered his name. And one day, without meaning to, he stopped thinking about the restaurant. He no longer walked by it deliberately. He no longer wondered what it meant. It had become part of the background, like a quiet street lamp or a tree whose fruit had not yet ripened. He had stopped needing it to open, because he had opened instead. It happened on a Sunday. He had spent the morning helping repair a ramp for a man in a wheelchair who had recently returned home from surgery. As he walked back toward the cafe to return a borrowed drill, he noticed something strange. The restaurant door was open. There was no sign, no customers, just an open door and a faint smell of yeast and herbs floating out into the street. Elon stood at the edge of the sidewalk. He did not step forward. He waited. And then the woman appeared, standing behind the counter as if no time had passed at all. Her hair was still pulled back. Her face was still calm. She looked at him the way she had looked at him the first time. But this time, she nodded. Just once. Not as an invitation, but as recognition. Elon didn't move. He placed the drill down gently on the bench beside him, nodded in return, and kept walking. It was not about going in. It never had been. By midsummer, the world had adjusted to Elon's absence like a forest absorbs a fallen tree. His companies moved forward, slower in some places, smoother in others. The media, hungry at first, had found other stories. For months, Elon had watched from a distance without interfering, until even watching no longer felt necessary. The machine no longer needed him to keep spinning. And for the first time, he no longer needed the machine to feel real. There was a young woman named Kayla who ran the community garden near the underpass. She had strong hands, a soft voice, and a fierce attention to detail. Elon began volunteering there every Tuesday. He tilled soil. He carried compost. He learned how certain plants needed more silence than sunlight. One morning, Kayla asked him why he came. Elon paused. Because this doesn't require me to be anything more than useful. Kayla nodded. That's a good reason. She handed him a packet of seeds and walked away. That afternoon, he planted the seeds one by one without rushing. For hours, he stayed in that narrow plot of earth, hands in the dirt, naming each row with quiet care. He had spent a lifetime engineering systems so large they stretched across oceans and planets. But in that garden, he learned the patience of waiting for things to grow without guarantee. The lessons kept arriving in small disguises. There was an old man named Jorge who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 60 years. Jorge had built benches in front of every bus stop without being asked. When Elon offered to help paint them, Jorge smiled and said, "You can't just paint a bench. You have to listen to it first." So they sat beside each one before they worked. They listened to wind, to footsteps, to the scrape of city life moving past. Only when the bench felt ready did they begin. Elon no longer wore the same clothes he used to. His sharp suits had given way to worn jeans and plain shirts. His watch had been replaced by a string bracelet a child had once tied to his wrist without asking. He never took it off. He still had money, all of it untouched, but he no longer carried credit cards. He paid for things in small bills or traded labor for meals. The economy of presence had become his currency, and something strange had started to happen. Not recognition, not fame, but trust. People began leaving their broken things on his stoop without notes or names. A toaster with a frayed cord, a broken frame, a music box with a cracked hinge. Elon fixed what he could and left them outside again by morning. He never waited to see who came to retrieve them. He was no longer building rockets or cars, but he was rebuilding something quieter, something that didn't make headlines or valuations. He was rebuilding what it meant to be enough. One night, after walking home from the garden, Elon found a small package outside his door. Inside was a loaf of bread, still warm, and a handwritten note on a paper napkin. It said only, "You were seen. You stayed. That matters." There was no name, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was her, the woman from the restaurant. Elon closed the door, sat down at his small kitchen table, and broke the bread in half. He ate it slowly, in silence, and let the warmth settle in his chest. It was not forgiveness. It was not approval. It was something more rare. It was acknowledgement. And that, he now understood, was the real currency of human life. The bread was gone by morning, but the feeling lingered. There was no follow-up, no second note, no sudden change at the restaurant. The door remained closed, the windows unlit. But something invisible had shifted between Elon and the world around him. Where once he would have searched for meaning in the gesture, now he simply received it. There was nothing to solve. There was only the truth that someone had noticed he stayed. The next few weeks passed with quiet steadiness. Elon fixed a refrigerator that had stopped humming in the community kitchen. He rewired a loose street lamp beside the library. He sat with a woman in her 80s who was afraid to go to the doctor alone and waited with her through the entire appointment. These weren't tasks. They were invitations. And Elon no longer measured his worth by innovation. He measured it by proximity, by who he could be close to without needing to be seen. One afternoon, while repairing a wobbly porch step at the edge of the neighborhood, a boy no older than 12 walked up and asked if Elon used to be someone important. Elon smiled. I still am. Just not in the way people expect. The boy looked confused. But aren't you? The guy who built the rocket cars. I was, Elon said. And I might be again someday. But right now, I build other things. Like what? Elon picked up the hammer and tightened the final nail. Like trust. The boy watched him work for a moment longer, then nodded and walked away. That evening, Elon passed the corner where the kids used to sell cookies. The table was gone now, replaced by a new wooden bench he had helped varnish the week before. He sat down and watched the sunset stretch long shadows across the sidewalk. A woman with tired eyes passed by, carrying groceries in one arm and holding her daughter's hand with the other. The little girl waved at Elon without breaking stride. He waved back, and for reasons he couldn't explain, the simple gesture brought tears to his eyes. He was no longer a spectacle. He was part of the landscape. The next day, he received an envelope in his mailbox with no return address. Inside was a card that read, "You are ready to be served." There was no signature, just a date. 1 week from now. Elon didn't mark it on his calendar. He didn't prepare. He kept showing up in the same ways, helping a neighbor move boxes, sharpening garden tools, teaching a boy how to solder two wires together without melting the joint. His days were full of tasks, so small they barely had names, but they held the weight of intention. When the date finally arrived, Elon didn't dress differently. He didn't arrive early. He walked to the restaurant at the exact hour written on the card and stood at the door like any other neighbor might. It opened without a sound. The woman stood behind the counter, hands folded, eyes soft. She didn't smile. She didn't gesture. She simply turned and walked to the back, where a single table was set for one. Elon followed her silently and took his seat. There was no menu. There was no other guest. Just one plate. Bread, olives, a small dish of warm soup. The woman returned and placed a glass of water beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "You stopped trying to be someone." "I stopped needing to," Elon said. She nodded. That's when people become real. Elon didn't ask what had changed. He didn't ask why now. He had learned enough to understand that permission isn't always spoken. Sometimes it arrives through who we become. He ate slowly, every bite tasting like something more than food. It tasted like belonging. It tasted like return. It tasted like the quiet reward of not giving up on the parts of yourself that no one else claps for. When the meal was finished, the woman did not bring a bill. Instead, she placed a small paper-wrapped bundle on the table. "For the next one," she said. Inside was another loaf of bread. Elon took it with both hands, not as a gift, but as a responsibility. Something had opened in him, and it could not be closed again. Elon walked home with the bread tucked carefully under his arm, the same way someone might carry a sleeping child or a fragile book. The air was soft that evening, the way it gets when a city finally exhales after a hot day. The sidewalks glowed faintly from the dim orange of the old street lamps, and every step he took felt like part of a rhythm he hadn't known he was keeping. He did not eat the bread. Instead, he waited. 2 days later, while walking past the library, Elon saw the teenage cellist who played with his eyes closed. The boy had been quiet lately. His case sat open beside him, but it was empty. Not just of money, but of attention. People walked past without slowing down. Elon sat on the curb and listened. The music was slower than usual. There was something unsure in the bow, something raw. When the boy finished, he looked up for the first time in minutes. Sounded different, Elon said. The boy shrugged. I don't know if it's good anymore. Elon reached into his bag, pulled out the wrapped loaf of bread, and placed it gently in the boy's lap. You don't have to be good, Elon said. You just have to stay honest. The boy looked confused but didn't move the bread. He simply sat there, cello in hand, as if someone had handed him something heavier than food. That night, Elon returned home and wrote a new sentence in the back of his notebook. Service is what remains after you let go of proving anything. Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Each time someone showed up in quiet need, Elon passed the bread along. Not the same loaf, of course. He learned how to make his own now. The recipe wasn't written down. It had been given to him without instructions. He had to feel it, adjust it, make mistakes. But that was part of it. The act of making bread had become a way of staying human, a way of offering presence in a form that could be held. Sometimes he delivered it himself. Sometimes he left it on a doorstep with no note. Each loaf was different. Each one carried the weight of all the days that had come before. The city began to feel smaller, not because it changed, but because Elon had finally slowed down enough to see it. He knew the bus schedule by heart. He knew which shops closed early on Sundays and which dogs barked only at passing trucks. He knew who needed help before they asked for it. And without ever calling it that, he had become part of the neighborhood. One afternoon, Kayla from the garden stopped him as he was trimming dead leaves off a tomato vine. I heard you got served, she said with a grin. I did, Elon said. What did it taste like? Elon smiled. Like I didn't need to explain anything ever again. Kayla laughed. That's the best seasoning. She handed him a bowl of blackberries and walked off before he could say thank you. The days stretched into early autumn. The lights shifted. The garden began to turn brittle around the edges. Elon repaired the fences before the first cold wind came. He reinforced the pantry shelves at the community kitchen. He fixed a broken water heater in the teacher's garage and replaced the cello boy's cracked rosin block without saying who did it. Each act was so small it barely had a name. But together, they became something whole. A life that did not require recognition to matter. The cold arrived without warning that year, sharper than usual and weeks ahead of schedule. People hurried more. Scarves and jackets appeared. The rhythm of the neighborhood shifted again. Mornings came slower. Nights settled earlier. Even the garden curled inward. Elon adjusted too. He started his days before sunrise, helping insulate windows for the elderly, sealing drafts in the bookstore, distributing firewood before the city supply ran out. No one asked him to coordinate. He simply showed up where the cold had found its way in. One night, as he was walking home after clearing snow from a neighbor's steps, he passed a mural he had never noticed before. It was new. A long stretch of color painted along the side of an old grocery wall. It was a scene of hands, not famous hands, not labeled or explained, just ordinary hands doing ordinary things. Repairing, holding, planting, sharing. At the center was a single loaf of bread, split down the middle, still warm in the painted light. There were no names, just a caption at the bottom, written in tiny brushstrokes. We rise quietly, together. Elon stood before it for a long time, not because he needed to be seen in it, but because he saw others now. He saw them completely. The mural became a meeting place. Not officially, not on purpose, but people began to gather there without knowing why. Conversations lingered longer. Strangers introduced themselves. Neighbors traded stories. Children traced the outlines of the hands and asked who they belonged to. No one knew, and that was the beauty of it. The restaurant remained closed again. The door was locked, the windows silent. But Elon didn't wonder this time. He had eaten the meal that mattered, and he had passed it on. By December, a quiet truth had settled around him. He would never return to who he had been, and he didn't want to. He still received emails from the world he had left. Offers, invitations, proposals wrapped in urgency. Some of them tried to appeal to ego. Others used fear. The language of legacy, of relevance, of impact. Elon read them without reaction. Then he deleted them without regret. He no longer feared being forgotten. He feared only becoming unlistening again. There was a boy he had once helped build a simple radio receiver. The boy had returned weeks later with a prototype he had made from scrap and wire. He said he wanted to catch the sky. Elon had told him that was exactly the right goal. He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. That boy's voice was now on local public radio every Saturday, sharing science news to an audience of curious kids and kind parents. Elon listened every week. There was a woman whose laundry machine he had repaired in early spring. She had gone on to start a community swap meet in the church basement, where families could trade clothes, tools, and books without cash. Elon had helped her move tables last weekend. There was a man who used to sweep the same sidewalk every day, talking to no one. After Elon brought him a new pair of gloves and a thermos, the man started greeting people by name. One day, he began telling jokes. Elon hadn't fixed their lives. He had simply stayed long enough for them to recognize their own power. He had become a different kind of engineer, one who built lives instead of things, one who repaired trust instead of systems, one who traded ambition for presence, and found that presence had its own gravity. By the first snowfall, the city had started to change in ways no one could quite explain. Not dramatically, not in ways that made headlines, but in rhythms, in gestures, in what people began expecting from each other. There were more shared meals now, not fundraisers, just food, left out on benches, delivered quietly, made in kitchens where people had once cooked only for themselves. The man who used to sell hot dogs on 6th Street had started offering free soup on Thursdays. A college student began leaving notes of encouragement tucked inside library books. A nurse donated her spare gloves to the corner store for anyone to take. The store stopped charging for coffee refills. No one told them to do it. They had just watched someone else do it first. And that had been enough. Elon never claimed credit. He had become part of the water table, the silent source beneath the soil of the community. Not visible, not tracked, not applauded. Just necessary, just consistent. One evening, he received a letter in a pale blue envelope. No address, no stamp, just his name, written carefully, like someone had taken their time. Inside, the letter read, "There is no spotlight in the work that saves us. Thank you for walking without it." It was unsigned, but it didn't need to be. By now, Elon recognized the handwriting. Not just the woman's, but the intention behind it. That quiet way of acknowledging someone without centering them. The next morning, Elon walked the neighborhood like he always did. He repaired a cracked fence rail. He showed a boy how to fix a tangled bike chain. He swept the sidewalk without needing a reason. But something felt different. People had begun helping before he arrived. The fence had already been reinforced on one side. The boy had found the wrench before Elon could offer his. The sidewalk had fewer leaves than usual. The city had started anticipating care. Later that day, he passed the mural again. Someone had added another hand. A child's hand, painted reaching upward, fingers outstretched toward the others. There was no signature, just a new caption added beside the original. The next ones are watching. That night, Elon lit a candle in his kitchen, not for ceremony, just for warmth. He broke another loaf of bread, now made with flour a neighbor had traded for fresh herbs. He ate slowly, gratefully, fully aware that none of this had ever been about transformation through achievement. It had been about returning to the version of himself that had existed before the noise. He remembered being a boy who built things just to see if they would work, who asked questions not to impress, but to understand, who stayed awake not to compete, but to wonder. That boy had never left. He had just been buried beneath the pressure of being watched. And now, without the pressure, he had come back. Not louder, not prouder, but deeper. The next morning, a neighbor asked Elon what he did for work. He thought for a long time before answering. "I take care of what's in front of me," he said. The neighbor nodded. "That's real work." And for the first time, Elon believed it. Winter deepened, but the cold felt less sharp now. The city had started moving in smaller, kinder ways. The changes weren't coordinated. They weren't optimized. But they held, because they came from people who had begun to believe that showing up, fully, quietly, without spectacle, was enough. Elon walked the same path each morning, but now the path recognized him. Not with praise, not with requests, just with nods, with warm bread left on a stoop for him to find. with tools waiting in a crate he had built months ago, with laughter that no longer stopped when he approached. He had become, simply and completely, part of things. One Sunday morning, as frost shimmered across every windshield, Elon returned to the restaurant one last time. He hadn't planned to. He had passed it without pause for weeks. But this time, something in his chest told him to stop. The door was unlocked. Inside, the lights were on, but dim. The woman stood behind the counter as always. She was older now, or maybe he was just seeing her more clearly. She didn't smile, but her eyes held something softer than before. "You're leaving soon," she said. It wasn't a question. Elon nodded. "I think the work is ready to grow without me." She motioned toward the same table where he had eaten months before. But there was no plate waiting. Instead, a chair faced the empty seat across from it. "You've been served," she said. "Now it's your turn to serve someone else." Elon looked down at the table. For the first time, he noticed the grain of the wood was worn smooth where hands had rested year after year. This table had seen more stories than it had voices. He didn't sit. He understood now. The meal had never been the point. The stillness was. The waiting. The refusal. The silence. It had not been punishment. It had been preparation. The woman stepped forward and handed him a folded cloth bundle. Inside was a small book, blank pages, a pen, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. She said nothing. He didn't need her to. He walked out of the restaurant with both hands full. The sky was pale blue. The wind had lost its bite. Children were drawing chalk stars on the pavement by the library. A man swept a storefront while humming. A woman hung lights from a balcony and paused to wave. The city had learned a new rhythm, and Elon had learned how to listen for it. He took the long way home, stopping where he was needed, offering without asking, receiving without question. He no longer tweeted. He no longer performed. He no longer introduced himself. And yet, he had never been more known. Because in the end, his next move hadn't been shocking. It had been something harder, something quieter, something true. He stayed, and he changed everything he touched by refusing to make it about himself.